I'm David. Aloha Wednesday, and welcome to my talk about the oral microbiome. So today we'll just cover a few key objectives, four things basically, versus the importance of the entire community, the oral microbiome community, what it does and how it impacts oral and systemic health. Also, not just how the community interacts with each other, but how beneficial bacteria really are a key player in this. And it's not just pathogens that drive disease. Learn how to optimize the oral microbiome and ways that you can modify it depending on what a test shows you. And we'll also have one case study at the very end just to demonstrate the powerful utility of oral microbiome testing and looking at the community as a whole. First slide is what is the oral microbiome? And in this picture here is a depiction of symbiosis. And so there's a clownfish, of course, that lives with its host, the sea anemone. And these two provide each other with stuff. So the anemone provides defense for the clownfish, and the clownfish cleans the anemone. And it's very similar in the oral microbiome, where bacteria in your mouth are actually really important in that they provide you with a particular variety of important tools, and you give them a home. And these bacteria are really important at maintaining your health. So the oral microbiome actually has over 800 different unique bacterial species that have been identified. And decades of research now, like actually call it centuries of research, have shown that certain bacteria in the oral cavity are really important at driving disease. And this goes way back to the discovery of bacteria themselves. When the microscope was invented, he looked at teeth and he said, wow, there's worms on these teeth in these people's cavities. And that's when we found out that strep mutans really causes cavities. And lots of research now shows that early detection and management of the oral microbiome and bacteria in the microbiome can basically affect trajectory and change the direction of disease. And so really important concepts here are symbiosis and dysbiosis, which I think most people are familiar with now, but just to reiterate, symbiosis is a state of balance, and also call it homeostasis, where a community is stable. And so in the image on the right, you can see on the left side of it is homeostasis, is where there's a certain abundance of beneficial bacteria that occupy a space, and they all live together in a biofilm in this home. And what's notable is that there's not just beneficial bacteria, there's also low levels of pathogens in here. And sometimes we call these commensal pathogens, where the low levels are really important for actually maintaining the community. And in dysbiosis, these beneficial bacteria actually are deficient. So they're mostly missing. And this gives space for these pathogens to take over and become opportunistic and really drive disease because they can cause inflammation when they're overabundant. So another depiction of this, which is very specific to the oral microbiome, is on a tooth surface. So here I'm showing an image of just what the gum line looks like. So of course the top is a tooth, and at the gum line, there's bacteria that live there. So there's different types of bacteria in different niches in the mouth. At the gum line, there are these anaerobic species because it's devoid of oxygen. Whereas on the surface of the tooth, there's more aerobic species. And these bacteria, they like oxygen. And so, of course, the two different areas in the mouth have very different communities. But importantly, in homeostasis, on the left, you have a high abundance of these beneficial bacteria that take up space, and then you have low levels of pathogenic bacteria. And these pathogens are really important, and I'll reiterate this later on. And on the right side, we have dysbiosis. And this is an unstable community where low levels of beneficial bacteria allow the pathogens to outgrow, and these pathogens can then cause damage. These low levels of pathogens in the homeostatic community are actually really important for training the community and training the immune system. And so there's a feedback loop that goes on with your immune system where these pathogens, they trigger the immune system and they tell it, hey, these are the types of things that you should remove. And that's what your immune system does. And it keeps everything in a balance. And there's these beneficial bacteria that regulate the growth of these pathogens. And they also do certain things, regulate virulence. They use up the space, they use up nutrients so that the pathogens can't grow so much. And they can interact specifically with certain pathogens to prevent certain types of interactions with your body, such as adhesion. And so without both the beneficial and these low levels of pathogens, the community is going to be unstable and is susceptible to dramatic shifts. And so we've seen this through years of testing now, where people who lack beneficial bacteria really undergo quite dramatic shifts depending on the types of things that are happening in their life, because the mouth is really an open cavity, which is assaulted by the environment and your diet and the things that you do every day. which is a little unlike the gut, which is not such an open surface and is not assaulted all the time by environment, but really by your diet. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have dysbiosis. And in dysbiosis, the lack of beneficial bacteria allows for these pathogens to grow. These pathogens drive chronic inflammation. Um, so they become overabundant, and your immune system overreacts, and it thinks that it should always remove these things because there's so much of them, and it basically destroys the tooth and creates a periodontal pocket. And on the surface of your teeth, these pathogens create high levels of acid production, leading to decay and cavities. So usually in dysbiosis, it requires some type of intervention to fix. And sometimes we call this a reset, an oral microbiome reset. And this type of treatment helps to return the entire community back to homeostasis. Hopefully, I've hit the point enough where the community is actually really important. It's not individual bacteria that drive disease, especially in the oral cavity. We know that in periodontal disease, specifically as an example, that single pathogens don't follow the traditional infectious disease rules. And really, disease is caused by the entire community. And so the lack of beneficials, along with dozens of different pathogens, really drive disease. Armed with that knowledge that the community is so important, we really decided to develop a test that looks at the community as a whole, not at individual bacteria as individual players in infections. And this is because there are dozens to hundreds of beneficial species, and it'd be impossible to look at them individually. And these species all promote certain types of activities. They can balance the pH on the surface of teeth. They can help remineralize teeth. But of course, they train the immune system and they suppress pathogens. And hundreds of species we don't actually know a lot about. So we only know about maybe a few dozens of them that were well characterized, but hundreds of species we actually don't know what they do yet, and we're still working that out. But we do know that there are core species that are essential for the oral microbiome to be in homeostasis. And of course, in dysbiosis, it's very similar, where you need to look at the community as a whole in order to understand the trajectory of a disease or the health of the community. So there's dozens of pathogenic species. It's not just five that are more infectious than others. It's really the community as a whole. These cross-species interactions are really important. So even if you have a really scary pathogen like Porphyromonas gingivalis, really its activity is much worse when in combination with other types of pathogens like Fusobacterium or Prevotella intermedia. And so the combination of multiple species is much more aggressive than individual species alone. And so our test is based on a technology called Shaka metagenomics. Shaka metagenomics uses all the DNA in a sample, essentially. And this is in contrast to other tests that you may have heard of or have used before. The oldest, which are on the right of this chart, and the Shaka metagenomics on the left. So conventional microbiology, of course, this is plating microbes. I think we still use this traditionally to look at hospital-acquired infections, certain types of infections where you actually plate bacteria and you see what's there. And there's newer technologies that may use qPCR. And so this really looks at the relative abundance based on certain targets. And of course, there's newer technologies like 16S RNA sequencing for gut microbiome sequencing. And this was a relatively cost-effective way to look at all the bacteria in a sample. But Shaka metagenomics allows us to look not just at bacteria, but also fungi, viruses. And it allows us to go beyond the resolution of 16S sequencing, which really looks only down to the species level, which we won't talk about today. But Shaka metagenomics allows us to look much deeper than that and all the way down to the genes of individual bacteria. And I will talk about that in the next few slides. Shaka metagenomics is looking at all the DNA again. And so this is just a depiction of a genome of bacteria. In this example, it's Porphyromonas gingivalis. Porphyromonas gingivalis encodes approximately 2,000 genes. Each of these genes performs a different function. And using Shaka metagenomics, we can look at all of those genes. And we can infer what this specific strain of Porphyromonas gingivalis may be doing, because it encodes certain types of things like different virulence factors or adhesion factors that may be different from other Porphyromonas gingivalis strains. And this informs us how this species may affect your health. And this test, the Bristle oral health test, looks at all the species down to the strain level of different bacteria in the mouth. And we use that information to provide some scores. And these scores are really informative about oral health and some about systemic health. You get a full breakdown of all the bacteria and some of the fungi that we find in the sample. And using all of this together, we developed ways to optimize the oral microbiome. And you get personalized diet and oral care recommendations based on the results of the test. Oral microbiome data is quite complex, as you might imagine, because you can detect hundreds of different species in a certain sample. And so we try to boil this down into scores that range from 0 to 10, 10 being the highest and 0 being the lowest. And the scores are really a summary of the community as a whole and how it impacts that certain health condition. And so there are 6 scores that we'll be talking about today. And each of these scores are very similar in their algorithms, in the way that they're scored. So 0 is always the lowest and 10 is always the highest. And this helps to normalize the understanding of how the oral microbiome might impact your health. So the 6 scores that we'll be talking about today are the beneficial microbe score. This is really important because it's a key player in the community. We'll also talk about tooth decay, gum inflammation, halitosis, and the gut, because the mouth is really just the gateway to the gut. And of course, nitric oxide, which some of you may be new to, but the oral microbiome is a key player in production of this molecule called nitric oxide, which is a regulator of vasodilation, so cardiovascular health and cognitive health. In this first score is the beneficial bacteria, and we really are summarizing the commensal bacteria and how they are helping to maintain homeostasis. And of course, these are really key in the community because if you don't have them, then you are in dysbiosis, almost by definition. And of course, here's a summary of the things they may do. So they help train the immune system, immune surveillance. They can prevent adhesion. They take up space just by colonizing the space and eating up nutrients. And of course, on the surface of teeth, they actually help to remineralize teeth by improving the pH and balancing that out. So this score, if you have a 0, is the lowest we've ever seen, and 10 is basically healthy. It tells you about future risk of disease progression. Of course, if you lack beneficial bacteria and you have carcinogenic species in your mouth, then you're more likely to have cavities in the future, because our understanding of how cavities work is that disease progression is caused by acid production by certain species in the mouth that can be reversed by beneficial bacteria. And beneficial bacteria can also be boosted either with probiotics or by improving diet and certain interventions. And we'll talk about that later. One really important thing to note here is that many people lack beneficial bacteria because of overuse of mouthwash. And there's been, in the last decade or so, there's been a lot of research that shows now that antimicrobial mouthwashes and their routine use is actually associated with dysbiosis and reduction in nitric oxide and cardiovascular risk. And now the understanding is that we shouldn't use these alcohol-based mouthwashes or so routinely, and we should avoid them for prolonged periods because of this increased risk. And so in tooth decay, particularly, the way that cavities are formed is that bacteria feed on sugar in your mouth, leftover nutrients from food you may eat, which usually now is highly processed foods. And so there's very simple carbohydrates that can be reduced into acid. And this acid damages the enamel. And so almost everybody has these early cavities in their mouth called incipient lesions. But commensal microbes in your mouth actually help to balance out that pH. And by increasing the pH, your teeth become remineralized. Every day, your teeth are actually undergoing this constant process of damage and fixing, damage and repair, damage and repair. But if you lack beneficial bacteria, of course, then the process of remineralization is not as efficient because the pH on the surface of the teeth is too low. And so the tooth decay score that we have here summarizes that risk. And so there's dozens of species that are associated with tooth decay that can create acid and that are really good at colonizing the tooth. And there are over 20 commensal counterparts that do the exact opposite, that actually can colonize the surface and compete with those microbes. High scores really tell you about the progression of decay. And the analogy that we use now is, do you have termites that are constantly eating your teeth? Or is this just prior damage that you actually don't have to worry that much about and that will repair itself over time? because you don't have any termites. And so on the opposite end, actually, if you have low scores and you have chronic decay, it may point to other issues, nutrient deficiencies, poor diet, or even mouth breathing. And so in the next score that we'll talk about is risk of gum inflammation, gum disease. And there are a few other tests on the market that look specifically at some pathogens, but we're finding that there's actually dozens and dozens of these pathogens that can cause inflammation, even more than have been tested by qPCR. And on the opposite end, of course, that commensal microbes, they prevent disease via direct competition. So they can kill the pathogenic microbes, they can train the immune system, and they directly compete by colonizing the gum pocket. And our score here actually summarizes all of that. And it tells you kind of what the risk is of, just like in cavities, of progression of disease. And so there's over 18 species for gum inflammation that go into the score and over 20 commensal counterparts. High scores typically indicate that someone may be at risk of periodontal disease. And periodontal disease is essentially when you get bone loss, it's not reversible. And so there's an optimal period of time when you would like to catch somebody before they've developed gum pockets, but when they start to detect that their gingivitis has gotten worse. And so if you use the test, then you can find certain patients that may be at an optimal time or intervention to reset the microbiome and reduce the abundance of these pathogens before they get irreversible disease. And one frequent thing that happens nowadays because of our highly processed food diets is complaint of halitosis. And we've actually developed a score that summarizes halitosis and what to do about it. So there's dozens of species that can cause halitosis, and it's because they metabolize certain compounds in your mouth, such as proteins or other leftover nutrients from your food, and create volatile sulfur. They create putrescine, cadaverine, and these all are foul-smelling compounds. And unfortunately, they reside in all the different surfaces of your mouth. So in the tonsils, on the surface of your tongue, at the gum line. And this means that people don't always know what to do. And everybody thinks, hey, if I floss more, then maybe that would solve the problem. But it turns out that a lot of people have different types of halitosis. And at Bristle, we've developed an algorithm that allows us to define the different types and to tell you what may be the cause of your halitosis and how to solve it. And so these 6 different types are inflammatory gum bacteria. So this is typically people who have periodontal disease actually typically complain of halitosis. There's also some bacteria that live at the gum line that are non-inflammatory. These can also cause halitosis. There's opportunistic species that can take over the mouth. And then there's ones that coat the tongue. There's an overabundance of fungi. And there's also tonsillar intermittent bad breath, which is sometimes more easily solved just by flushing the tonsils. Those are the 3 kind of oral health indications that we provide scores for. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the oral microbiome and systemic health and how it affects the rest of your body. We swallow about 100 billion bacteria every day. And these microbes, they travel through the gut. Some inevitably, some of them will pass through the stomach acid and actually end up in the gut. They can survive that travel. And they can also travel through the bloodstream. And so we found that bacteria can actually be found in atherosclerotic plaque and even immune cells in the bloodstream. And some species from the oral microbiome can impact other sites in the body in 2 ways. And the first way is through traveling and directly colonizing that region. For instance, there's oral microbes that end up colonizing the gut and causing dysbiosis there. And they can also train the immune system. And so there's a very strong association between IBD and periodontal disease that we'll talk about. And this is through training Th17 cells to do something different that they don't normally do. And they train them in the mouth, and that manifests in the gut. And so, of course, the mouth is the gateway, and you are what you eat. And unfortunately, you are eating the bacteria that also reside in your mouth. And dysbiosis in the oral microbiome is associated with all these diseases: so Alzheimer's disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, adverse pregnancy outcomes. And just like we talk about the oral microbiome as a community as a whole instead of individual infections, we also treat the mouth as part of the body, and it's the whole body. It's connected to everything, and you can't look at things in a vacuum. Things aren't in isolation. So in this first example, we'll talk about how the oral microbiome affects the gut. And so there was a study decades ago that showed that people with IBD have increased odds of having periodontal disease and vice versa. Um, and then more recently, through some studies, they had found that there are certain species that are associated with both diseases, and they found them in the mouth and the gut of patients. And these are Klebsiella and Enterobacter. And they do two things, of course. So Klebsiella, if it's overabundant in the mouth, then you're swallowing it every day, and it will colonize the gut, especially in people who have unhealthy guts. And if your gut microbiome is devoid of species that are taking up the space, then Klebsiella has space to take over. And then, of course, Klebsiella also in the mouth can train the immune system, and it regulates inflammation in both places. And the immune system is basically treating it as a foreign invader and will attack anything that looks similar to Klebsiella. And that's why you end up with this connection between the gut and the mouth that was not intuitive before we started looking at the microbiomes of both. And our test does provide insight into both Klebsiella and Enterobacter. And not only those two genuses, but also in colorectal cancer, which of course is associated with IBD. But people are finding now a very strong causation between this species called Fusobacterium nucleatum and progression of colorectal cancer. And so this species is actually found directly in the colorectal tumors. And people who have certain strains of this species have poorer prognosis. And typically their cancer is much more aggressive and less treatable, even though Fusobacterium nucleatum is common. And it's actually a commensal species in everybody. Almost everybody carries Fuso. It's really when the community shifts and allows Fuso to act in ways that it doesn't normally. And this is what leads to adverse colorectal cancer outcomes. And so the score that we provide, we summarize a number of different species, including Klebsiella, Enterobacter, Fuso, Campylobacter species. These are all species that are known to affect both the mouth and the gut. We provide a score that can tell you how the oral microbiome may affect your gut. And this is useful, especially in people who have unresolved gut issues, who have tried every gut probiotic. It turns out that it may not originate from your gut. It may be because you're swallowing these bacteria every day, and they're training your immune system every day. And you really should start by treating the mouth. And the next thing we'll talk about is cardiovascular health. And we will touch on this molecule called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is, of course, this important vasodilation molecule. It regulates cardiovascular health and cognitive health. And there's this pathway that's well described in bacteria in the oral microbiome that can metabolize nitrate and turn it into nitrite and nitric oxide. But this pathway is quite complex and involves multiple different species. And sometimes molecules are passed between species, and each species can play a different role in this pathway. And the only way to really look at this pathway is to look at the community as a whole. And of course, our test is capable of doing that. And so we provide this nitric oxide score. Using shotgun metagenomics, we look at all the genes, actually. We look at the genes that contribute to nitric oxide production, and this allows us to provide insights into what the capacity is of a microbiome to produce nitric oxide. It doesn't tell you exactly how much nitric oxide you are producing at that moment, but it can tell you if you supplement your diet with nitrate or you're eating the right foods, do you have enough bacteria that produce these genes that can contribute to nitric oxide production. And there's also a few other relationships between the oral microbiome and systemic health. We don't provide scores for these, but we are hoping that future research will allow us to provide insights into how the oral microbiome affects these types of diseases. But we don't do anything for them today. And so the first association that's quite strong is with autoimmunity. So rheumatoid arthritis is one autoimmune disease where people have found that there are certain triggers, and those triggers are actually from the oral microbiome. Some bacteria, such as Porphyromonas gingivalis, Prevotella intermedia, and Aggregatibacter, they can produce certain types of enzymes that can modify the immune system, essentially. And this has been shown to be causal in some people with rheumatoid arthritis. And not only colorectal cancer, but other types of cancers as well. Some Studies have found oral dysbiosis in people with pancreatic cancer, and even that oral microbiome, certain species of the oral microbiome have been found in tumors, variety of origins, so pancreatic cancer, oral cancers. And of course, we talked about nitric oxide being important in cardiovascular and cognitive health, but the oral microbiome doesn't just impact cognitive health through nitric oxide. There's dozens of studies now that show a direct relationship between the oral microbiome, certain species, and Alzheimer's disease. So Campylobacter and Porphyria gingivalis are strongly associated with progression of Alzheimer's disease and worse outcomes. And there's a number of clinical trials now that are looking at modifying the oral microbiome and seeing if that may improve cognitive health. But of course, these studies are very long and the results are still forthcoming. All right. So now we've talked about what the test can do, but really the question that we always get is, great, so I get these results, but what can I do about it? And fortunately, the oral cavity is very treatable because it's right there. And there's a number of different things you can do at home, even to optimize your oral microbiome. And so hopefully everyone's undergoing a healthy home care routine, which involves brushing, flossing, hopefully an oral probiotic, hopefully not using a mouthwash, tongue scraping, and the most important thing is an optimal diet. So in this slide here, it's very dense, but it's just providing a backdrop of all the things that you can do to update your home care and to personalize it. And for instance, which we'll talk about in the next few slides, for someone who has certain types of species in their mouth that are carcinogenic and that cause cavities, you can change your brushing routine and you can add in xylitol or arginine to reduce tooth sensitivity and to try to reduce the abundance of those microbes. Or you can change your oral probiotic routine and switch up different species and different strains, depending on what type of oral microbiome you have. And of course, with diet, which is one of the hardest things to change, but you have basically unlimited tools to use to modify your diet. And not just home care, we also provide recommendations on how you can modify in-office interventions. Of course, this would be with a referral with a dentist or a periodontist, depending on the patient. And so there's certain types of treatments in office that are better for certain types of oral microbiomes. So someone who has periodontal disease or is on the edge of periodontal disease may be a better candidate for ozone therapy or a laser rather than someone who just has gingivitis and doesn't have very high gum inflammation scores. And so we've also produced this at-home care guide, which goes through all of these different options, and we compile different brands that we trust because we know that the ingredients that they use are today is what we think are the best ones. And of course, there's new products that come out on the market all the time, but most of them don't have research behind them. And we like when people do research and provide data. And so some of these have clinical trial data or at least anecdotal data behind them. And so just to get into some examples of the types of treatments that you can do and how you can optimize for your patients is with toothpaste, you can optimize by changing just the product. And so here are three things that you can use. It's hydroxyapatite, arginine, and xylitol. And they've been studied extensively to show that they are beneficial for the oral microbiome and in ways that they can remineralize teeth, they reduce sensitivity, they boost beneficial bacteria, and they reduce acid production. And of course, this is key to keeping enamel healthy rather than allowing incipient lesions to progress into cavities that need to be filled. Flossing routines. So most people undergo a standard string flossing routine. Hopefully people are doing this at least 3 times a week. So our research shows that if you're doing this 4 times a week, then it's much better than doing it 1 to 3 times a week. Hopefully people are doing this daily. And for people with certain types of microbiomes, water flossing is actually much more beneficial because you can optimize water flossing. You can use hydrogen peroxide every other day to reduce anaerobic bacteria that love periodontal pockets. And periodontal pockets are almost unreachable using traditional string floss. And so water irrigation is actually a tool that they use in the dental office, and you can buy a water pick at home to try to get at the same efficiency. Mouthwash, of course, we touched on this. Mouthwash, frequent use of broad spectrum antimicrobial mouthwashes is detrimental to the oral microbiome. It increases your risk for hypertension. Um, and so we don't recommend that anymore. And now we recommend short-term uses of it to treat dysbiosis and to reset the microbiome. And so we recommend that people don't use it for more than 2 weeks at a time if you have to use an antimicrobial. But generally, if you're going to use a mouthwash, try to avoid antimicrobials like CBC or like chlorhexidine. So we like more gentle mouthwashes, ones with chlorine dioxide, very low concentrations, or ones with xylitol, which of course helps to prevent tooth decay that we touched on in the toothpaste. And there's also some mouthwashes that only have essential oils. Essential oils can be controversial because they are a little understudied in the microbiome. However, they are effective at reducing halitosis and gum inflammation. So using them for short bursts, like the 2-week period, can be beneficial. And on diet, this is just 3 very simple and easy things to do for people with high gum inflammation. Increase their nitrate. And nitrate reducing bacteria actually directly compete with periodontal species, and they are by feeding them nitrate, you can actually boost their levels. And this is found in beets, leafy greens, and there's some supplements now on the market that also provide increased nitrate in the oral cavity. Vitamin D, the deficiency is associated with the higher risk of gum disease and in cavities. And you can find this in a variety of places. And the third one here is just omega-3s, found mostly in fish, has some antimicrobial activity, especially for pathogens that cause gum inflammation. And changing diet for tooth decay. So very similarly, taking vitamin D because a lot of people are deficient. And then the other thing is arginine. So arginine is metabolized by some bacteria in the mouth, and this turns into ammonia, which boosts the pH on the surface of your teeth, and this helps to remineralize. So this is part of that cycle that I talked about previously. And if you supplement arginine onto a biofilm on the surface of the teeth, it actually changes the composition, which enables more of the beneficial bacteria to colonize the surface rather than allowing karyogenic species. And another really important tool we have that has been underused is oral probiotics. And so oral probiotics actually have been researched quite a bit, and they produce these molecules called bacteriocins that can kill certain types of pathogens. So oral probiotics are especially good for gum inflammation. Some of them are for cavities. I'll show that on the next slide. And probiotics, of course, also affect the immune system and inflammatory responses, and they can regulate that. And this can reduce chronic inflammation, especially in the cavity. And so this is just a quick summary of some of the species that we know have beneficial actions for certain conditions. So in gum inflammation, look for a probiotic that has Lactobacillus reuteri and plantarum and Bifidobacterium lactis. For someone with high levels of strep mutans or other tooth decay causing bacteria, Lactobacillus paracasei and salivarius both have clinical trials and research behind them that demonstrate their efficacy. And in halitosis, especially, I use Streptococcus salivarius. There's 2 different strains that are well studied, and Lactobacillus reuteri that can reduce the abundance of some of these anaerobic pathogens that cause halitosis. Just a quick drop here for the Bristle probiotic, which includes 6 of these, 6 strains here for gum inflammation halitosis specifically. So this probiotic that we developed in-house is specifically to reduce the prevalence of gum disease and halitosis. It's really for those types of patients. And you can also take it daily as a kind of maintenance to help optimize your oral microbiome. Great. So in the last 10 minutes, I'm just going to go through a case study that kind of demonstrates really the utility of our test. And this is a really big one because it was uncanny. And so this is a case for this patient who had undergone a variety of dental treatments over years and years, and he was already meticulous about his hygiene. He had no cavities, and yet every single time, basically every month, he undergone these blisters. He called them mouth blisters, water blisters, and he had no idea what was going on. He went to his dentist and was referred to a periodontist. Had some pockets and was still unable to get it under control, and constantly had this issue despite having this type of hygiene routine where he was brushing 3 times a day, was flossing 3 times a day, using a water pick every day. He even kept a food diary, and he basically never ate sugar, and still had this type of problem where he was having these pockets that were bleeding, watery blisters. He was referred to his first periodontist in 2017, and they found nothing. So they did a qPCR test that looked at, I think it's like 12 or 11 different species here. So this test is on the right, where they basically said everything looks totally normal. There's nothing here. So we have no idea what's going on. And then in 2018, went to another perio specialist, had an SRP, which is a scaling and root planing, had treatment, and still it wasn't resolved. So nothing changed. And he had 4 different specialists over 4 years because all of them had done something similar but slightly different, variations of SRP and antibiotics, and still no change. And then I think 4 years ago, he took a Bristle test. And what we found is that his commensals were basically missing, completely lacking, and his diversity was at 0, which means that he had one species that took over everything. And at the time, we had never seen anything like this before. We didn't know what it was. And so all of his scores showed up perfectly normal because our algorithm at the time didn't understand that there was actually something wrong in his mouth. And so we looked at his raw results, at the abundance of the different species, and we saw this one species that took over his entire microbiome. It was 78% of his microbiome, which is incredibly rare. It's called Serratia marcescens. And Serratia, at the time, we had not seen it. And so we did some digging, and we found that there were some studies that showed that Serratia can colonize the oral cavity and is opportunistic. And Serratia is typically known for being that pink bacteria that you might find on your bathroom wall if you don't clean it. And he was searching for answers, even though we got him this test, we didn't know what to do at the time. And through some research, we basically said, can you try this? Can you try using xylitol many, many times a day and adding in a probiotic to try and attack Serratia? This is a timeline of his testing. And these percentages are just his abundance of Serratia marcescens. So after his first test, 79%, he took chlorhexidine for 2 months and there was no change. He still had these abscesses or water blisters 1 to 2 times per month. And he took another test and it was still the same. And of course, chlorhexidine didn't really do much for him. And after that, he added on the xylitol, which he started taking 3 times daily. He made his own mouthwash and he started taking these mints. And his abscesses started to reduce. So he only had 1 in that period of 6 months before his next test. And during that period, he also added in a probiotic and he started taking it 2 times a day. And then in his following test, he had no Serratia and he no longer had these abscesses. And so he was doing the xylitol rinse 3 times a day. And now he was taking the probiotic once a day for maintenance. And so now today, he no longer has these abscesses and his periodontal pockets are basically healthy. They're all less than 4 millimeters and he doesn't have bleeding, and he also no longer has Serratia overabundant in his mouth. And so this is just highlighting the importance of the community again. So when this one species took over, his entire microbiome just went haywire and his health just went haywire. And during this period of time, in the first half of this graph on the left, he had a number of symptoms, of periodontal symptoms, such as those abscesses. And he was also lacking any commensal bacteria. He had none of it. And by the time that he had finished his round of personalized treatments, he now has a very healthy level of commensal bacteria. And his scores have jumped up to 9.6 to 9.9. And his gum inflammation scores have reduced to the healthy range. And he only knew this because he took a Bristle test, because of comprehensive shotgun metagenomic test. And so this is just from This is a testimonial from his dentist that the test really helped to guide all that effort. And he couldn't have done that without the test. And this is what we try to achieve for almost every patient, to try to resolve some of their unresolved issues using the oral microbiome test. Great. And now we have, I think, 9 minutes for questions. If you have any questions after, you can always email providersupport@bristlehealth.com, or you can contact Brian or myself, David@bristlehealth.com.
Welcome to Rupa Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.